industry-wide term, book and plan. It's very specific to Computershare we're talking here. DRS versus DSPP.
Well, versus, I don't know. I mean,
Right.
these all, any investor is going to make their own decision, but yes, DRS and DSPP.
I would like to start with a quick summary of DRS and why one should care.
As far as DRS, an overview, it's an acronym that stands for Direct Registration System. And this is a method through which investors who are holding their shares in a brokerage can move those shares through this DRS to be held with the transfer agent. We're going to talk more about transfer agents later, but for right now, just know that they're the company responsible for tracking ownership of publicly traded issuers and companies. So, if you are someone who cares about a company, you invest with them through a broker, you actually could have a more direct relationship, directly register your shares or your stocks with that company. And DRS is the system by which you can.
Great. So the company, the issuer knows about you, that you exist. A very simple way.
That's right.
Great. I'll put a link up there in case you haven't watched the previous episode. So you can go watch our full discussion from last week. Perfect. So now moving our discussion forward, right? One thing you just said is the transfer agent. So why don't we actually discuss what these transfer agents are and what functionality they provide to the issuer, but also to the client, which is the retail here, right? Actually, let's define them. So there are two parties here, right? So there's the issuer and there's obviously the client to them. What are the roles they play across both?
Sure. So maybe we can we'll try to take a step back here, and we'll talk about the structure. So you've got your issuer, right? This is your company that is maybe issuing shares into the market. They're publicly traded. We see tons of tickers all the time, and each one of those public companies must have a transfer agent. A transfer agent is a different type of company whose main responsibility is to keep track of the stockholders of their clients. So, if any company you can think of is publicly traded, they have a transfer agent who they hire on, who they contract to provide essentially bookkeeping services regarding ownership of the people that are invested in that company. And it's not just tracking in a ledger the names and information, but it's also doing things like helping to distribute dividends, distributing other kinds of company information like proxy vote material for the AGM, or other kinds of missives or information gathering, or just acting as a front-end customer service line if someone who is directly registered has a question or needs help if they're trying to sell or to get a certificate, something like that. So the transfer agent is acting in this capacity, and each publicly traded company is mandated to hire on a registered transfer agent with the SEC. So any transfer agent's gone through this registration process. They do all these different things, and essentially, that's kind of the idea here.
Why can't they do the bookkeeping themselves? Why do they need a third party to know and keep record of who owns the shares? The whole dividend side you mentioned. Why do they need a third party that's specialized in this function?
That's a great question, and I think the main answer is going to be history. A lot of these laws trace back to like the Securities Act 1934 in the U.S. markets. This is a time, before you had any kind of electronic record keeping, and there was a necessity for a centralized transfer agent to be tracking and collating ownership as it changed, because people were trading around certificates, and there was just a lot more specialization that went into it. If you were a business, you wanted to focus on your business, and you'd hire out a specialist to do this kind of work. And it's kind of a holdover, right? So transfer agents are still necessary today. What's interesting is that companies can choose to act as their own transfer agent if they want to. And there are some companies that do, to your point. And maybe they find that that's a bit more efficient. And obviously they must if they're doing it. But the vast majority of publicly traded companies in the US do contract out a transfer agent specialist. And, whatever it is that they pay per year for those services, we don't have a lot of good insight into that. It's all proprietary, these contracts and these fees. But point being, they must feel it's worth it to have this outside entity take care of this. But there are some that choose to do it through books.
So how many transfer agents are there? I know Computershare is there. I know the Equinity, I think, is there. So there are a few transfer agents out there, right? And they play a very different role than obviously your traditional broker. They are not brokers; they are transfer agents that do the bookkeeping for the issuer. So how many transfer agents are there? What are the difference between them?
Sure. So one really key thing that I want to just mention first that differentiates them in a massive way from a broker is that a transfer agent is not able to hold cash for you. They're not holding any kind of asset. All they're doing is tracking information.
So they're accountants mostly.
They're just maintaining this ledger and distributing information, to holders on that ledger accordingly. So I think that's one really key distinction to keep in mind. As far as your question about how many transfer agents there are, I don't have an exact number off the top of my head, but I believe it's in the hundreds, as far as in the US market that are registered. But most of these are individual managers. A company had to register as a transfer agent, some branch of itself, to manage its own books, for example, and so they're just doing a small amount of actual transfer agenting. There's a lot of monopolization in this space, actually. The vast majority, something like 80% plus of the transfer, of the market space is dominated by just a handful of transfer agents. You've got Computershare, which is the market leader, and they've got, by far the most. I believe at last it was 25% or so of the market, and something like 70% of companies in the S&P 500 use Computershare as their transfer agent. Then you also have a couple others, Equinity, Broadridge, and just to shout out that Equinity and AST were both acquired by a third party and merged together in the last couple of years, and each of those were a top 5 transfer agent. And Computershare purchased the transfer agent branch of BNY Mellon in the last couple of years, which was also a top 5 transfer agent. So that is massive consolidation at the top just in the last couple of years.
One of the things I didn't ask you, which I thought it would be good to ask you now, is what are the different types of DRS? Because one of the things I've noticed over the years is there has been a debate between, there are 2 different types of DRS. One is book and one is planned. I wanted you to clarify what they are, how they differ. Do we care about them, or does the issuer care about them? Like how do they work together? So I just wanted to explain, because that's something I want to learn myself. What are the different types of DRS?
Well, I definitely appreciate your asking me about that, and I agree with you that it is an area of much contention and discussion. And so I'm glad to say that everything that I'm about to bring up has, thanks to the efforts of YDRS and our team, been corroborated by Computershare. Most of what we'll discuss today in terms of book and plan, and I'll get to the details on that shortly, but this is going to be specific to Computershare. You'll find that just the book and plan labeling is specific to Computershare's UI. And so that's what we're going to be discussing.
So it's not the industry-wide term book and plan. It's very specific to Computershare we're talking here.
They are the transfer agent which labels their user accounts in that way. And
right.
We'll get into a bit more detail about that shortly, but I want to make sure to direct people. Ankit, please make sure in the description to link out to Computershare's FAQ, where they've done a great job updating with a lot of great questions that are going to pertain to this coming discussion. And a lot of those questions, came from our team that we wanted to make sure were expanded in the FAQ, and they graciously did so earlier this year in May. So I was glad to see that. So, as to your question, right, book and plan. What I want to say first is that there is not 2 kinds of DRS. The one that is labeled book in Computershare's UI is what we can think of as DRS. And that refers to there's no intermediary between the investor and the asset. They own it completely and totally on the ledger of the issuer. And that is the only labeling that fits that description. I think where a lot of the confusion come from initially is that there's a term, a recognized industry term, called book entry. What book entry means is uncertificated electronic. Essentially, it's a share that you own or an entitlement that you own, but is not certificated in any way. It's housed in some kind of electronic system somewhere. And so not only does any broker share count as book entry, but of course, so does a DRS share as well, or a plan share. So then we can think about, so what is plan then? So a issuer plan, there's a variety of different types, and I'll kind of, I'll do an overview, and then we can dive in as much as we have time for. But there are sponsored issuer plans, and there are unsponsored issuer plans. A sponsored plan is something like the company says ahead of time, okay, we're going to issue this much stock as like a shelf reserve, and anyone who's interested can buy it from us, and it can be distributed in this way, to people who want to buy it. An unsponsored plan is something closer to what I think most people are familiar with at Computershare, the DirectStock Plan. That is something that Computershare offers to their clients that companies like GameStop and AMC each are subscribed to. What that does is, rather than coming from the company, when people invest in that plan, it is still being bought at the market. And that's accomplished through a broker partner of Computershares. And so then this kind of brings forward, how is that possible? As I said earlier, transfer agents cannot hold assets. So Computershare has, not only do they have a subsidiary broker that essentially just houses things like temporarily, but they also have broker partners to facilitate sales and purchases at that market. Now that broker subsidiary, or essentially it holds all the shares together in what's called a fungible bulk, and they're held by a nominee. And this is something that I think people can definitely review on that FAQ page, because they go into the chain of custody in detail. But essentially, you have first DRS, where it's just, the individual owns the asset. Then you have the plan, where the nominee of Computershare, this nominee entity, technically holds all the assets in a fungible bulk. And then they keep a record of which investors have claim to which percentage of that fungible bulk. And you're named in a subclass to track that kind of ownership. One key thing to note here is that the issuer does have visibility into that, those names on that subclass. So even though you don't have 100% direct ownership through the plan, you are still completely visible to the company that you're investing with. So that can be, if that's important, if that's one of the reasons that you're doing this, but you still want the flexibility of a plan, then that's something important to understand. And then lastly, there's a third, so almost done. There's a third type of ownership chain that is available here, where in order to facilitate those buys and sells at market, right? Computershare, they're providing a service. They want it to appear liquid and easy and convenient. So in order to provide quick settlement, they keep a percentage, an undisclosed percentage, of that fungible bulk of shares that are owned by the nominee. They keep that deposited with their broker partner, and that means that those shares are technically in CD & Co. through DTCC. So there's a subsection, a small subsection of those plan shares where the chain of custody goes, CD, broker, Computershare, and then the investor. And there's no way, unfortunately, for an individual investor to know if their plan shares are held by the nominee and there's just one step, or if they're actually held by CD and there's some other step. Because again, it's a fungible bulk. So it's not like any specific person has their shares held in this way. It's a fungible bulk.
So do you know the percentage difference between book versus plan for, let's say, GameStop? Has there been information released? How many people actually sitting on the plan side?
There's not been any official release of that kind of information by GameStop. However, we do have some visibility into those bulk numbers, thanks to the efforts of some shareholders to go and view the stockholder list in Grapevine and GameStop's example, where there's essentially you gain access to a representation of the ownership ledger at the record date for the AGM, like for the voting rights at AGM. And so I think in 2024, that date was April 19th, if memory serves. So we have information about the book and plan distribution on April 19th, through that bulk, auditing. Now that being said, though, there's not a direct primary source. And one thing that I just wanted to touch on, just since we're talking about book fee plan here, a couple things real quick. First is that I don't think it's proper. Like anyone who thinks plan is just as bad as a broker, I don't think that that's quite right. I think there's definitely a graduated, if you care about ownership, there's a graduated, one-way path here where broker is worst, fine, but then plan in the middle, and then DRS last, because you do have all of those direct relationships with your company if you are holding in a plan, and I think that is definitely important to shout out. And I do think also I just want to mention that the name book fee plan I think can be confusing because that relationship to book entry that I mentioned earlier, I see folks still today sometimes get confused and think, well, if book entry is all shares, then they're both books. So what's the problem here? But I like to think of it more as a DRS. I don't even know about versus, but let's say DRS and DSPP, which would be a direct stock purchase plan, and use that as the delineation. That's actually the terms. If you go on holding your securities FAQ page at the SEC, that's how they define these different things. So that's the terminology that I think is most apt.
DRS versus DSPP.
Well, versus, I don't know. I mean, right. Any investor is going to make their own decision, but yes, DRS and DSPP is the umbrella labels that I would like to see us use.
Right. Yeah. Instead of plan, you prefer it to be DSPP, which is what SEC says as well. Okay. Perfect.
Exactly. I mean, unless it was a DSPP is typically going to be an unsponsored plan. That's what I mentioned before. Meanwhile, a DSP is going to be usually a sponsored plan. So that's, one more layer of the onion.
GameStop. Do we happen to know how many people are sitting on the book versus plan side? Well, DSPP.
I just needed to pull up our page on drsgme.org about the 2024 stockholder list data. So let's see. So there were 75.46 million shares that were listed on the stockholder list. So what that is a representation of is all the shares that are not held by CD & Co. And then of those, DRS was 62.17 million, and plan or direct stock is 13.29 million. So the majority of it is DRS.
Right. 13 million, did you say, on the DSPP side, on the plan side? Did you say 13? Yeah.
13.29, yeah.
13.29. So it's still a huge number. I thought I was expecting it to be very small, but interesting.
Yeah, I mean, that information is out there. I guess we can pop a link in the description as well to the drsgme.org page.
Like anything that you missed out that you wanted to talk about before we move on to the Issur side?
I guess one last thing that I'll just mention. One reason that I think a lot of folks might be involved still with DSPP is if they're an international investor, like a non-domestic U.S. investor. It's typically going to be much cheaper for them to invest through the plan and then terminate that plan periodically to move their shares to DRS, rather than trying to invest through a broker and then dealing with exorbitant transfer fees and DRS fees, which are traditionally much higher for investors outside of the domestic U.S. territory. So just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very good point, that for non-U.S. citizens, the process is cumbersome, process is hard, it's lengthy, and it's expensive. So it makes sense for more people outside U.S. to use the DSPP feature, the plan feature on Computershare, for example, in case of GME. Which totally makes sense. So thanks for clarifying that. I think it sort of highlights to a lot of people that, okay, it's not just people are doing it, it's because there's a purpose to it.
Right. I don't want anyone to be shamed for participating in the plan.
Right. Which is, I think, very important to clarify that, it's still part of the issuer still sees who you are. They still see how many shares you hold. But it serves a different purpose because it's needed. Right? You've clarified the transfer agent's role early on. But the next question I wanted to ask you, what can Issur see? Okay, so now let's say I am with Computershare. I hold some assets, some shares into GME. What can GameStop see about me? What can they find out about me through this data? And then what can they do with this data? Because now, obviously, for the first time, they can see about myself, right? Through a brokerage system. Let's say I was with Fidelity, they wouldn't know who I am. They wouldn't know where I live, because this data is confidential and is part of Fidelity. It's not, it's sitting with DTCC system somehow, somewhere, but not with the issuer. So now, given I'm with let's say Computershare, they know who I am, where I live, what else they can see, and what can they do with this data?
Sure, absolutely. Well, first, I think that you're driving a really important thing to understand about the different types of ownership that are available to us, whether or not they're direct or beneficial. Where, as you mentioned, holding through the brokerage system, there's this anonymity involved. Where, although the broker knows who you are, but the broader system and the issuer certainly they don't. What most issuers see is just a handful of names. And probably with 99.99% of the shares owned is CD & Co. As listeners may already know, this is a DTC nominee which owns the vast majority of shares that are issued into the market today in the U.S. And so that their name, that nominee name of CD & Co. is on every public stocks ledger and is probably the largest shareholder of every public company. It would be difficult to verify that, although I think it's a safe bet. And as people choose direct registration for their investments, that issuer ledger is going to flesh out, right, with some more data. And now to your actual question about what can the issuing company see, they can see your name, they can see your address, they can see the amount of shares that you own, and if applicable, the different classes of share or the different categories of share, such as DSPP or DSP that you own. And what they can also see is a history of the credits and debits of that listing. So if you buy more shares, they're going to see when that happened. If you sell shares, they'll see when that happened, and et cetera, et cetera. So that's really the bulk of it. So as far as personal info goes, name and address, and then beyond that, they can see the actual ins and outs of the account that you're holding.
So the issuer can see, in that case, who I am, where I live. They can also see how often I'm buying, if I'm buying very often, which gives them a lot of insight. And just between these three variables, if I'm the issuer, I can definitely see a lot of patterns being created here. So what can they do with this data? And are they doing anything with this data that's been given to them? Let's say, in the case of a couple of companies that are releasing this information.
Yeah, I think this is one of the areas that I'm most excited about for the future of ownership. So at this time, I'm not aware. There's been no released information about what exactly these companies are doing or what they are planning to do with the access that they have to this information that I'm aware of. Now, that being said, there's an incredible gulf of possibilities, I think, that start to emerge out of this space. If we think about, a company maybe is considering some kind of expansion, but they aren't sure about a variety of different markets that they might want to expand into geographically, then having insight into where your most passionate long-term shareholder base is located could be really helpful to influence that decision. Or perhaps, if they are needing to close some business in some areas, maybe this is, the same metric in reverse could be helpful to decide things. Similarly, one exciting idea would be you could send out mailers, right, to all these individuals, and solicit some kind of, hey, what do you think about this product or that product? You've got like an in-house access to the perfect marketer's wet dream, I think, all this information. So there's a ton of possibility space there, although at this time, I'm not aware of anyone really taking advantage of it.
Right. So you're tying all the information that issuer can see, you can tying that to some sort of marketing activity, some sort of expansion activity that can be done off the back of that data, right? Now, does Issur have my email address? And you said they can see the details, but can they communicate with me?
Because they would do that through the transfer agent. So they could dictate the transfer agent to send some communication out and do it that way. And one neat thing there that I want to just kind of clarify is that so the transfer agent is going to try to send that same communication out to every shareholder. And what that'll usually also mean is sending it, through CD and Co. to the brokers, to the people that are invested that way. But you could do that's going to be a more delayed delivery of a message as opposed to direct from the transfer agent with an email, right? And so there ends up being multiple stages of data that then the issuer can gain in this way, based on how quickly people are responding and in what way they are responding.
So these transfer agents, right, Computershare, AST, they do not communicate via email, right? They usually do via physical letters. Is that true? And why is it so? In 2024, why are they still communicating via the physical letters?
Well, I think these are just older companies with an older framework that have not been forced to modernize. They do definitely have email options, I think, but there are definitely, I don't think you can opt out of like your quarterly statement, for example. I'm not aware of that being like a regulatory necessity to send it via hard paper mail, but I don't know if there's a better answer than these are old companies in an old system, and as they are developing a larger base of people that are clamoring for updates to these systems, then perhaps they will update them. But I think one thing people maybe need to remember is that if you're holding in as a DRS investor, right? So you're just holding directly with the company with no custodian between you and your investment. The transfer agent, like, you're not a client of theirs. You're not really doing business with them in any way. I mean, they are facilitating your access to this information, but their client is the issuer. And so the user interface that an investor is seeing is not going to, it does not need to be as friendly as a broker's might be. It does not need to be as feature rich as a broker's might be, because you're not really expected when you're dealing with this kind of system and this type of ownership to need those tools that they're used to, dealing with long-term investors, you buying and setting and forgetting, and there are opportunities to buy and sell through their platform. In Computershare's case, with DSPP and many of their clients. And yeah, in those cases, you're using a Computershare service and you are a Computershare client at that time. So they're going to, probably listen a bit more. There'll be more features for that. But I just wanted to kind of mention, because I do hear some frustration about how these businesses are structured. And I think with the historical context and remembering how they butter their bread, it's understandable.
Right. So you're saying that the issuer will have a better interface.
They should. Yes.
They should. Love to see actually how what information and how the interface looks on the issuer side one day, perhaps, because I've seen myself on the retail side, and it's ugly. Yeah. And I think we can share that sentiment with a lot of people that find it not friendly at all across many transfer agents we've looked at. But no, thanks for clarifying that. One last question I think, Chives, I had for you was why we've only seen, I think we were talking in last episode that why we're discussing in 2024 DRS. Well, one thing that I wanted to ask you is why in 2024 we're only seeing 2 companies that are disclosing the number of people retail holds their shares via a transfer agent. Like, there's only 2 companies that I'm aware of, that's GameStop and AMC, that are releasing that information on quarterly basis. Why only 2 companies in 2024?
Well, I will refer back to the conversation that you posted, at the lead of the last video that we did, when I had the opportunity to speak with Chairman Gary Gensler about a similar question. And to paraphrase his answer, he shared that companies will share the information that they feel is materially important to their investors. So I think the best non-speculative answer that I could give to your question is because these companies don't realize that it is of material importance to their investors. And what that means is that investors must use the channels available to make that material importance known to the companies. And that means submitting letters through the proper channels to the board of directors. That means submitting proposals through the AGM to release this information on a timely basis, or trying to communicate with movers and shakers on social media.
Let me get it straight. So you're saying that it's not important, it's not a material important information for the issuer to release this information.
Well, according to Chairman Gensler, right, there's no issue with, there's no problem should any issuer choose to release this information.
Okay.
It's of no consequence to them, but it is an extra bookkeeping task. It's doing something above and beyond from the boilerplate requirements of a 10Q or 10K. So, of course, they're not just going to do that without some kind of material reason, right? Like one might expect for a for-profit company. So
right.
The investors need to lay the groundwork and make clear that they are invested in, that they want this disclosure of information. And although a person holding through a broker, holding entitlements of a company, maybe they can reach out as well. But I would anticipate that a person that's directly registered, that's going through the proper written channels that are available to us as investors, tutorials for which you can find on ydrs.org. I think that's going to probably be more, companies will be more receptive to hearing messages in that kind of direct framework, where they can also check their ledger and be, oh yeah, look, this guy has been holding with us for years, and he just wants to see more of this information.
Like if the numbers are too small, there is no need to disclose this information because such a
right. Exactly. I mean, if 99.99% of your issued stock is being held by CD & Co. and trading in the the brokerage system, then why bother? I can appreciate not viewing that as important, and probably these boards of directors or the finance engineers that within them, they're not going to look twice at that, because it's been the same for 20 or 30 or 40 years. That nothing is any different. But that number starts to change, and they start to get letters asking for more disclosure, I see no reason that they wouldn't comply.
Yeah, I think that explains a lot. The legal counsels, the CFOs, will start to obviously change the way they're writing this the quarterly reports and perhaps start to release. But yeah, I think there's a lot of work needs to be done before then.